Hello and welcome to GeekyBit Bonus. Today we'll be talking about real hardware or hardware emulation. So when is it hardware? When is it emulation? When is it hardware emulation? And is there a clear-cut answer? Well, yes and no. There is obvious emulators and there's obvious hardware, but then there's also FPGAs that are a bit of both. So hardware is obviously when you're running the software on the real physical system it was made for. Emulation is where different hardware is used through the use of software to interpret the software to something that the host system understands. And lastly, there is FPGA emulation or hardware emulation, where you are using a chip that can configure itself to be the same as the original hardware. So now you might be wondering, which is better? While hardware purists say running things on the real hardware is the best, the issue is hardware has a shelf life, and many older items are dying without a lot of replacements. Many people are currently working to make hardware replacement options for those older systems, but there are just some things that aren't currently replaceable. The rarity of real hardware also makes it fairly pricey to get into unless you get lucky finds. Then there is the speed. Some older systems are just plain slow. Here are the things about real hardware. It typically works when it does. Things aren't usually buggy, and it doesn't make weird random results. Emulators, on the other hand, can run faster on the same system you use for everything else, providing a seamless experience. Emulators can also be a lot more economical, as you don't need to buy much of anything to get them working aside from the software you are planning on running and some ROMs. When it comes to emulators, speaking of ROMs, some companies don't want you to use their ROMs, paid or otherwise, and will go after you with their full legal wrath. So emulators can be faster and better, but also buggy and sometimes legally dubious to use, so they have their major issues too. Lastly, there is the hybrid child of hardware and software known as FPGA emulation or hardware emulation. Is it any good? Right now, a lot of real hardware replacements for older hardware use FPGAs, so it is the closest you can get to real hardware. So whole unit FPGAs like the Mr. Project are good at just being like the real hardware and providing a similar real hardware experience, but they also use ROMs like emulators. So in the end, you can have the same legal issues as emulators, the same upsides as real hardware, and cores have to be made by somebody for you to be able to use with the system. And if they aren't, then they aren't available. With everything said, all of the options have upsides and all of the options have downsides. You should never let people tell you which one you should choose. Personally, I like real hardware the best. Here are some of my thoughts on hardware versus emulation. Personally, I think the best thing would be to do is to make universal FPGA CPUs and have cores for drop-in replacements of CPUs and GPUs, then universal secondary processors. With a project like that and a project to recreate blank boards for all older systems, I think we could make a much lower cost new version of those old systems with better longevity. It is something I think we really need because we are seeing the older hardware die a slow death with no real replacements for future generations to get to enjoy it. Think of it this way, a person today can see a nail from the 1800s and they can easily be reproduced, but a person in 2220, are they going to be able to see a computer of our era? Probably not, which is why we need to work hard to make open source hardware replication projects. But for our current era, I think you should use whatever is the most accessible to you to get a chance to experience the old software products that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, feel free to like it. And also, if you aren't subscribed so already, feel free to do so. And if you'd like to get notifications of future videos, please click that bell button.